So maybe talk a little bit about kind of the situation before we met.
Yeah,
what you were looking at as far as I remember you had a couple of people that had approached you and you weren't sure exactly what the right strategy was, but maybe kind of set the stage just from a kind of options you were thinking about when we first met.
Yeah, so we had over capacity in terms of production at our facility, and so we thought the best thing to do to gain capacity would be to merge with a competitor to bring capacity to the facility. So we originally engaged with you thinking that's the format we try to pursue, and we knew there were big competitors out of the region and a large, strong competitor in California, and so we weren't quite sure how to approach both simultaneously while trying to find ourselves the best deal possible, while also not tipping anybody off that we were interested in merging.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have this concern so often from owners that I don't want my competitors to know I'm looking to sell, and I don't want to include them on the list because I want to give them sensitive information. I don't even want them to know that we're selling.
It's a very real fear, just the thought of a competitor being able to tell customers that you share that, hey, these guys are looking to sell, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't play well. It's not the message you want projected.
And I think in your situation, one of the things that was even more unique than what we always see that where there's some competitor that, the owner and company doesn't want to know or include. That's pretty common. But in your situation, it was pretty unique because there was really two major players in California. And so one of those, probably the primary option, which is where you ultimately sold, was your other competitor in California that kind of really ruled that market. So maybe talk a little bit about how.
Yeah, they were a strong company. They were good operators, and we shared basically the same customer list. We knew that. We had never really interacted with them in any way, like 5 years previous to working with you. We were aware of them. We knew who they were, but there wasn't a strong relationship there at that time, and so we didn't have the ability to just call them and say, "Hey, we're thinking about this. What do you think?" That's why we brought a third party in to help us navigate.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about the strategy that we ultimately employed, because if I remember correctly, we're thinking let's kind of approach them, talk to them about doing a merger. There was actually a third party, which I think was another kind of thing that made it more complicated because it was a private equity firm that wanted to kind of provide the capital to bring the two companies together. But ultimately, we wanted to create a competitive dynamic, which is what we try and do whenever we're running the sale process, because it tends to happen if you're only selling to one party and they know it, they have more leverage than you want. So, we ultimately kind of went down the road of getting ready to go out more broadly.
Yeah, we did. We put a deck together, and on your advice, we didn't name a price or anything like that. We just said, here's the assets, here's the general volume, and we're prepared to go out to the market more broadly. But fortunately, because of your advice, we were able to make a decision to sell. So we made that decision, I think, fairly earlier on than I anticipated we would. Just the dynamics of their third-party capital partner kind of forced that issue. But we were also very concerned about our ability to negotiate while being in an exclusive negotiating situation with somebody. So because of your advice, we were able to negotiate a term sheet that we were satisfied with, that was detailed and had elements that normally occur later in the transaction. We negotiated up front.
That's I think an important factor, because it's what we always find. Once you sign a term sheet where you're giving exclusivity to one buyer, the balance of power shifts. Because up until that point, they're competing to be the buyer.
That's right.
But once they sign exclusivity, you can't go and talk to anybody else during that exclusivity period.
That's right.
Legally.
That's right.
And so from our standpoint, it's always really important that we get as much negotiated into the term sheet. And a lot of times, a lot of that stuff will get pushed out until you get into the legal docs, which you go from a 5 or 6 page term sheet to a 40 or 50 page purchase agreement.
Right.
But getting some of those details into that term sheet can be pretty critical. If you can, and talk about some of the specific things in your situation that we put into that term sheet that wound up being important.
Mm-hmm. So we were able to come to terms on a price that we were satisfied with. So obviously that's huge, right? And then there were the items around the escrow amounts, holdbacks, caps on future liabilities. Are the right way to say that?
Yeah. Because
caps on
ultimately,
liability.
that's one of the things we do, and I don't think a lot of people really understand, is we're divvying up the risk.
Right.
Because when you sell a business, as you know, going through it now, you don't just walk away, put money in the bank, and say, thanks a lot. You have to, represent what it is you're selling them.
That's right.
And if they don't get what you said they were getting, then they can come back and say, hey, wait, this wasn't what we thought it was. There was more liabilities here than you said, or there was,
That's right.
facilities weren't in the condition that you said they were in. And so you can have post transaction liability.
Mm-hmm.
So those things like how much they hold back in escrow, which is what they can draw, what they typically go to first to get money, could have a significant impact. And ultimately, the total amount that they can come back to you after the sale gets negotiated. So it can be as important as the purchase price.
That's exactly right. And I think what was crucial in that process was you being able to educate us as the sellers to understand that as quickly as you did and as early in the process as you did.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been easy for you to just let that slide and get us into an LOI and let the process continue. But that would have had serious repercussions later on.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other thing in your case, which we always deal with this as well, is working capital. Getting that nailed down, because that was a meaningful number.
Right, exactly.
To the transaction in your particular case.
Yeah.
So having that,
key.
and that was
defining that up front and setting all the parameters, not most of the parameters, was key to getting this deal done. Yeah.
Good. So you've lived through it, and I say that and mean that. It's definitely a adventure. So maybe talk about some of the things that surprised you along the way.
Yeah. So our industry is not huge in terms of companies comprising the industry. It's a fairly large industry in terms of dollars, but in terms of companies producing the products, there's not that many. They're all very well known. There's a handful of vendors. Everybody shares everything, right? Mm-hmm. So going into the transaction, or even the concept of this transaction, we thought the diligence should be straightforward. We thought, okay, look, we're obviously going to be either merging or selling to a company in our industry that's doing more or less the exact same thing we are. So we thought, okay, they're going to come in here, they're going to understand like 95% of what's going on. So we're going to have to, get our act together on the other 5%, and then we'll have a deal. It turns out there's much more to it than that. And thankfully you were able to educate us and drive that entire process. My estimate, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we probably created 5,000 documents for this transaction.
That wouldn't surprise me if it was in that range.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal amount of paperwork. And, what you brought to the table through the process was the detail, the level of detail. Every Monday at 11 o'clock, we had our weekly call, right, to talk about what we knocked out the week before and what we had to do this week. And every single one of those phone calls was at least 3 or 4 pages, single-spaced bullet point items. I mean, it was like the worst group project you can imagine in college.
Yeah, because it's a great analogy actually, because you're working with people that you don't control, right? It's like a true college project where it's your classmate, and they maybe don't care if you get a C and you want an A, and it's you can't get them to put an A effort in because you want an A effort in.
Right,
so you're dealing with buyers and their staff and their attorneys and their advisors, and you don't know where you fall on their priority list on a particular day, and and you're trying to get them to do things that are critical in order to move the business forward. I find in the M&A process that I almost view it as, whether you use the analogy of climbing a mountain or just a series of hurdles. And you probably saw this during the process, that's why we love to do the weekly calls. Like, what is our biggest thing that has to get done this week? And it's a matter of what's the next most critical hurdle we need to get past.
Exactly.
Let's focus all our energy on that. There's a lot of things we have to get done along the way, but you have to get past those kind of gating items and let's figure out what that is and what's going to keep us from closing from a timing perspective. Like I remember permits were a big issue at the end.
Right.
You wind up having to try and get on the board schedule in order to get an approval for one of the permits that needed to transfer. And people just don't think about those kinds of things, that you have to figure out if I'm going to get to here and I'm here, what are all the steps in between and what's going to keep me from getting to that finish line and that timeline. And I got to focus on those items so that I can keep progressing.
Right. So setting up your gating items is key. But what I felt was even more crucial to the ultimate success of the transaction was that when you set up those items and we knocked them out, they were done. We never thought about them again. So we did everything correctly the first time. We never had to revisit stuff we messed up or skipped over or didn't pay enough attention to.
Yeah, and you need somebody who's been through that a number of times.
Right, exactly.
Because like I said, 5,500, whatever it is, there's a lot of little things that you have to deal with.
Exactly.
And have somebody, it's almost like a project management role that we take on once we get into that phase. I mean, part of what we're doing is finding the buyer, part of what we're doing is negotiating the deal, and then part of what we're doing is managing that deal to the close.
Yeah.
And making sure everybody's doing what they need to do along the way. And a lot of people think, well, I'll just have my attorney do it. Well, the attorney does one piece of it, which is the legal docs.
Right.
There's so many other aspects to it, and if you don't have an advisor, then that falls on you. And I'm sure you can attest that this took enough of your time with an advisor trying to do it without one.
Well, the project management piece is by far the most crucial because going into the transaction, I had a very strong sense of who our ultimate buyer, merger partner was going to be, and I was right. I had a very strong sense of what the price needed to be, and I was right. But I had no sense of the project management needed to make those two things happen.
Yeah, and in your case, it was pretty critical that we get to the finish line with that buyer because they were the best buyer. So you're talking a little bit about kind of the synergies that were there with this buyer, and maybe you can elaborate on that because it's pretty important on why they really were the best buyer.
Yeah, you quickly helped us understand that they were the best buyer because they were in the region. They were capacity challenged to an extent, and it was a great match because of our capacity excess. So because they were already in the region, you felt that they were able to capture all of the synergies available in this transaction versus an out-of-region buyer who would be basically kind of just assuming our role.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things. We're always looking at synergies because that's where we can kind of get outsized, returns for a buyer when somebody can realize more by combining the two companies than they can on their own. There's usually different types of synergies, and in your particular case, you checked all the boxes.
Yeah, we did.
I mean, you guys had sales synergies where you guys had products they didn't have, and you guys could do cross-selling. You had cost synergies because you guys could buy more volume and you have more leverage with suppliers and growers because of the larger. You had customer synergies because you were selling to the same customers, and they would basically pair you guys against each other and try and get the lowest price, and you guys have to chase yourself to the bottom. And so, just across the board, and probably the biggest one obviously was the capacity. You had excess capacity and they had limited capacity.
Yeah, and I think another meaningful synergy was transportation.
Mm-hmm.
When you go from shipping LTL to straight loads, that's a huge savings on freight cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys also had a pretty significant asset in the size facility you had with cold storage.
Yeah.
Because cold storage is such a, just the limit of it out there. And for them to try and find enough cold storage would have been very difficult. And for them to build it from scratch
Very expensive.
would be very expensive and take a long time.
Very expensive, take a long time. Sizing it correctly when you're doing a new build is very difficult to judge.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good situation.
And then that also kind of played into the dynamic with the out-of-market players. And there was one big out-of-market player that really wanted to get in the market. So having that competitive dynamic within the transaction process, I felt was important because, either side kind of knew that if you guys didn't team up, there was a chance that the third party was going to come in, or potentially that party from out of state could buy or merge with one of you, and then the other one would kind of be, at a disadvantage because it was a much larger player. And also that, player didn't have capacity. They'd either have to build, which takes time, or they have to acquire.
Right.
So that was pretty important as well.
Exactly.
To having them as almost a stalking horse out there that if you couldn't get a reasonable deal done, that there was another player that could really shift the dynamics.
Yeah, I'm not sure they were so much as a stalking horse. I think they were a viable candidate, for the transaction.
Mhm.
And speaking of the synergies, that's exactly why that my assumption before we brought you into the transaction was that we're basically 95% of the way there,
Yeah.
just by the nature of our businesses,
Yeah.
right? Because I knew those synergies were there. I knew that the buyer knew those synergies were there. I kind of thought it wouldn't take much to get them to be on the same page,
Mhm.
but I wasn't considering all of the diligence items that we ended up knocking out,
Mhm.
right? All of the things that we have to go through and show and reports that we created.
And it was interesting in your case as well, because there was certain information which was pretty important financial information that we weren't willing to share until
Right.
we got pretty much to the point where we knew we were closing.
Right.
So that was, I think,
There was also information around our process that we didn't want to share. We were doing some things that were unique in the industry we didn't want to share. All that kind of stuff, because obviously if we didn't get to a transaction completion, they were going to remain our competitor.
Mhm.
So we didn't want to give them any inside information without them paying for it.
yeah, I think that probably led to the most tense moments in the whole transaction, because especially the private equity firm kept saying, we need the rest of the information. And we kept saying, you guys have to get to a point where you say you're done with your due diligence. Basically, I mean, we essentially made them get to a point where they said, no, we're good. There's no open items before we shared some of that critical information.
Yeah, I think it was a fair compromise. I mean, I understand where they were coming from. They're spending money. They need to know what they're getting. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we needed the comfort in order to be able to share that information that, okay, we're doing a deal now. We're not just telling you everything you want to know just because you might be doing a deal.
Mhm.
You really helped us understand the dynamic and bridge the gap.
Yeah, and we try and play that, we get to be the bad guy, so to speak, and sit in between to try and push back. It's always easy theoretically at the front end to say, oh, yeah, we'll get that later.
Yeah,
We're good with that. We'll start our due diligence, and then
Right.
we'll get the key information once we're certain the deal's getting done. But defining when that point actually is something else, and, actually having people spend the time and energy and money to go through the process and then wait for that is much harder.
Yeah.
And so I know in this particular case, we had to fight hard to get them to a point where the deal was pretty imminent by the time we really opened up and gave them everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad it was you talking with them and not me, But another great thing is that it was easy to trust you from the get-go. You know what I mean? Like, everything you told us came to pass either right away or eventually.
Mm.
So we developed a great working relationship from the get-go, and that was crucial.
Good. Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So had you not gotten DCA involved, what kind of do you think would have been the outcome, or how would it have been different?
That's a really good question. I can't even imagine having done this without DCA. I don't think we even got, without DCA, I don't think we get to step one of a deal before we find some hurdle that's insurmountable.
Good. Well, we're glad that we had the opportunity to work with you and get a successful outcome. Any advice you have for other business owners that are considering a sale?
It's not a fun process, but if you're interested in a sale, it's a worthwhile process. You have to understand that what you're doing is not just resulting in money for you at the end of it. It's also the security of keeping that money post the transaction, right? Because there are things that can happen post closing that could result in you having to give a substantial amount of that money back.
Yeah, well, especially in a business like yours, where there's a lot of low cost labor. That's one of the things, divvying up the risk between the parties on, any labor or employment related issues prior to the sale can stay with the seller, and you got to make sure that you're negotiating what they have to assume and what they're keeping.
Yeah. And the things I was thinking of specifically have to do with the facility, because we ultimately ended with an asset sale, and so that's really what we were selling. And to be able to protect yourself in an asset sale, you have to really understand your facility, all of the different components and equipment that you have. But more importantly, you have to communicate that to the buyer effectively, and you have to make sure that they understand what they're looking at.
Yeah, well, in your case too, I mean, we didn't talk about this much. It was maybe not one of the critical components, but certainly something we had to deal with, was that you had multiple businesses and you were doing an asset sale. So it wasn't the entire business. It wasn't a stock sale where all the liabilities passed. So we had to carve out what it was they were getting, because there was things they were not getting. And what they weren't getting, some of what they weren't getting were also liabilities. So making sure that you were keeping the stuff that you really should keep, and they were getting things that really they should be responsible for was, I think, also important in this case.
Yeah. Another great thing that you brought to the table was Weintraub and your relationship with Weintraub and Chris Chediak specifically.
Yep. That's good.
I was very impressed with them. Working with Chris is great. I give him a lot of credit for the lawyering he did in this transaction and working with the buyer's counsel as well.
Well, we also had Ron Flaherty involved, who's really knowledgeable in your industry. So we were glad to partner with him. He knows the space really well. So
in the ag industry, what we say is Ron speaks ag.
He definitely speaks ag. That's all he does.
You're kind of a city slicker, Ron.
I'm good at the transaction side. He's better at the industry side. I'm give him credit for that. But we're starting to do a fair amount in the space, and it's good to have him around to provide that translation for us.
Yes.
Good. Well, we appreciate you taking some time to talk through your experiences and sharing with other potential clients and people that are thinking about maybe doing a transaction.
My pleasure. Thank you for the help.
All right.